My mind drifted back to the contemptuous words printed so neatly on the gold-plated invitation sent by my ex-husband's family, because they truly believed they were inviting a broken woman to serve as a backdrop for their happiness, while humiliating someone they had discarded years ago. The boisterous noise of my two sons echoing from the living room did not annoy me in the slightest, because the sound of screaming and crashing toys was actually the signal for the chaotic storm I was preparing to unleash upon their solemn ceremony. I let a cold smile touch my lips while whispering a final promise to myself before stepping out the door, confirming that there would be absolutely no tears shed today, except for the tears of those who had once trampled on my dignity. Do they want to invite me just to see a joke? Fine, I will not just give them laughter. I will bring them the most chaotic circus they have ever witnessed. If you are ready to see how a rejected mother turned a royal wedding into a total disaster, hit that subscribe button right now so you do not miss the chaos. The memory of that horrific night 5 years ago remains intact in my mind, like a scar that never truly healed. It happened during one of the most brutal winters in Maine history, when the wind was howling outside like a wild beast trying to tear the house apart. I was standing in the grand foyer of the Montgomery estate, while clutching my pregnant belly with trembling hands because my mother-in-law, Irma, had just thrown my only suitcase out into the snow. She looked at me with eyes devoid of any human warmth, while accusing me of carrying another man's children, simply because she refused to believe her son could father twins. Irma screamed that she would not allow a gold digger to dilute their prestigious bloodline with illegitimate offspring before ordering me to leave her property immediately. I turned my desperate gaze toward my ex-husband Curtis, hoping that he would finally find the courage to step out from behind his mother's shadow to protect his wife. But Curtis just stood there staring blankly at the polished floorboards while refusing to make eye contact with me, proving that his loyalty to his mother was far stronger than his vows to me. His cowardly silence cut deeper than the freezing wind outside, because it shattered the last fragment of hope I held for our marriage. I walked out into the blinding snowstorm with nothing but a coat and a broken heart until my best friend Sarah found me shivering near the highway and took me into her small apartment. Sarah became my lifeline during those dark months by holding my hand through a difficult labor and helping me navigate the suffocating fog of postpartum depression. She was the one who told me that tears would not pay for diapers and that I should channel my overwhelming rage into building a future that the Montgomery family could never touch. I took her advice to heart by spending every waking moment while the babies slept studying financial markets and learning the ruthless mechanics of debt acquisition. I stopped being the naive girl who begged for love and transformed myself into a relentless businesswoman who understood that money was the only language people like Irma respected. Over the next 5 years, I worked myself to the point of exhaustion to build my own firm from a small home office into a significant player in the distressed debt market. I specialized in purchasing non-performing loans from failing businesses at a fraction of their value before restructuring them for massive profits. My company grew rapidly in the shadows because I used a complex network of shell corporations to keep my identity hidden from the public eye. I quietly acquired portfolios of debt from struggling real estate developers in New England, without anyone knowing that the ruthless shark behind these deals was the rejected daughter-in-law of the prestigious Montgomery family. I monitored their financial situation from a distance and waited patiently for the perfect opportunity to close the net around them. The opportunity finally arrived 1 week ago when my secretary placed a heavy envelope made of expensive cream-colored paper on my mahogany desk. I opened the seal to reveal a wedding invitation engraved in gold leaf announcing the union of Curtis and a woman named Whitney. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from Irma that dripped with the same venom she had spewed at me 5 years ago. She wrote that she hoped I would come to witness the wedding of the worthy heir to the Montgomery legacy so I could see what a real high society marriage looked like. I stared at the elegant calligraphy for a long time while a cold smile slowly spread across my face because she had no idea what she had just done. Irma thought she was rubbing her victory in my face, but she was actually handing me the key to her destruction. I picked up the phone to call my legal team because it was time to collect the debts that had been accumulating for half a decade. It was that Sunday morning when thick fog, typical of the Maine coast, blanketed the cobblestone road leading to the ancient estate. I navigated the battered Toyota Camry I had borrowed from one of my junior analysts toward the imposing iron gates, while my two sons Kyle and Kevin chattered excitedly in the back seat about the ocean view. The rusty sedan looked comically out of place, sandwiched between a sleek black Rolls-Royce and a silver Bentley that were waiting in the line of vehicles carrying the elite of New England society. I could feel the cheap plastic of the steering wheel sticking to my palms, but my grip remained steady because this beat-up car was an essential prop in the theater production I was directing today. The contrast between my vehicle and the parade of wealth around me was so stark that it almost felt like a social experiment designed to test the arrogance of the upper class. The line moved forward slowly until my vehicle stopped in front of the security checkpoint where a stern-looking man in a dark uniform was checking invitations with military precision. He scanned the dented bumper of my car before moving his gaze up to my plain t-shirt with an expression of open disdain that made it clear he believed I had taken a wrong turn on my way to the service entrance. He did not even wait for me to roll down the window completely before he stepped forward to block my path with an authoritative hand gesture meant to intimidate unwanted visitors. The guard leaned down with a sneer on his face while ignoring the two innocent children sitting in the back, who were watching him with wide eyes. "Hey, you, the entrance for the catering staff and cleaning crew is located behind the kitchen area because this main gate is strictly reserved for the guests of honor." I did not flinch at his rudeness because being mistaken for the help was exactly what I needed to lower everyone's defenses before the final strike. I calmly reached into my bag to retrieve the gold-embossed envelope that Irma had sent me and held it out the window with a steady hand. The guard looked at the expensive paper with confusion before looking back at my worn-out jeans, as if his brain could not reconcile the two conflicting images. "Please check your guest list again, because my name is Loretta, and I believe that Irma is eagerly awaiting my presence at her son's wedding." He frowned as he scanned the list on his clipboard multiple times, hoping to find a reason to turn me away, but eventually he had to press the button to open the heavy gates. He sneered at me as I drove past him, but I just smiled internally because his contempt was proof that my disguise was working perfectly. I parked the car in a remote corner of the lot to ensure it wouldn't be blocked in later, and then walked hand in hand with Kyle and Kevin toward the manicured gardens where the ceremony was about to take place. The guests were already mingling on the lawn holding crystal flutes of champagne, while showing off jewelry that probably cost more than the college tuition for an average student. The conversation died down in waves as people noticed the three of us walking through the archway dressed in clothes that would be considered casual for a grocery run, let alone a high society wedding. I could hear the sharp whispers of women covering their mouths with gloved hands as they speculated about who had allowed the riffraff to wander into such an exclusive event. Their eyes raked over my jeans with judgment while I held my head high and looked directly at the mansion that used to be my prison. We reached the edge of the seating area where the white folding chairs were arranged in precise rows, facing the flower-covered altar overlooking the gray Atlantic Ocean. I knelt down on the grass until I was eye level with the twins, so I could give them their final instructions for the mission we had practiced in our living room for weeks. They looked at me with eyes that sparkled with mischief because they sensed that today was the one day they were allowed to break all the rules of good behavior. I straightened Kevin's collar and smoothed down Kyle's hair while whispering the command that would unleash the storm upon this peaceful gathering. Kevin, do you remember the pirate game that Mommy taught you at home? This entire garden is the treasure map, so I want you to run and find the gold right now." It was exactly 11 o'clock at noon when the melodious sound of the violin began to signal the start of the official ceremony, But that was also the moment when chaos descended upon the manicured lawns of the estate. The heavy oak doors of the mansion opened slowly to reveal Curtis's fiancée Whitney, who stepped out onto the white carpet looking like a porcelain doll encased in layers of expensive lace and silk. She was smiling radiantly at the guests who were turning their heads to admire her beauty, completely unaware that two small hurricanes were about to tear her perfect moment to shreds. Just as Whitney took her first step toward the flower-covered archway, I gave a subtle nod to my sons to signal that the treasure hunt had officially begun. Kyle and Kevin launched themselves forward like two arrows released from a bow, breaking the solemn silence of the garden with shrieks of pure childish delight that echoed sharply against the stone walls of the manor. They did not run down the aisle in an orderly fashion, but instead wove through the rows of seated guests while tagging expensive suits and dodging outstretched legs. The attendees gasped in horror as the two boys treated the sacred space like a public playground, knocking over floral arrangements and causing elderly ladies to clutch their pearl necklaces in sheer terror. Kyle spotted the towering display of crystal champagne flutes stacked precariously on a table near the front row and sprinted toward it with a mischievous glint in his eyes that I knew all too well. He collided with the table leg with enough force to send the entire structure wobbling violently for a heartbeat before it came crashing down in a spectacular explosion of glass and liquid. The sound of hundreds of crystal glasses shattering simultaneously was deafening, followed immediately by the collective scream of the women in the front row as they were drenched in sticky, sparkling wine. Irma stood up abruptly from her seat of honor near the altar, her face flushing a deep shade of crimson that clashed horribly with her silver dress. The veins in her neck bulged as she watched the ruin of her meticulously planned event, unable to comprehend how her display of wealth had turned into a disaster zone in a matter of seconds. She pointed a shaking finger at the two boys who were now laughing amidst the wreckage of the champagne tower, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. Security. Where is the security? Drag these uneducated brats out of here immediately, because they are ruining the most important day of my family's history. Curtis looked down from the stage with eyes wide with panic as he watched his bride freeze in the middle of the aisle with a look of absolute horror on her face. He realized that his mother was losing control of the situation, so he decided to take matters into his own hands by rushing down the steps to confront the intruders personally. He strode toward Kevin, who was standing near the fallen table, and reached out aggressively to grab the back of my son's collar to physically remove him from the premises. However, just as his hand was inches away from the boy, Kevin looked up with wide, fearful eyes that mirrored the exact shape and color of the man reaching for him. Curtis froze in mid-motion as if he had been struck by lightning, his hand hovering uselessly in the air, while his brain struggled to process the impossible familiarity staring back at him. He leaned in closer, studying the boy's jawline and the distinctive way his eyebrows arched, features that he had seen in the mirror every single day of his life. "Who do you belong to, and how dare you run in here? Wait, why do you have my eyes, and why does looking at you feel like looking at a ghost?" The guests nearest to the altar had stopped murmuring and were now watching the scene with bated breath, sensing that something far more scandalous than a few broken glasses was unfolding before them. I knew this was my cue to step out of the shadows, so I stood up slowly from my seat in the back row with the composure of a queen reclaiming her throne. I smoothed down my simple t-shirt and began walking down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically on the stone path as I approached the man who had abandoned me 5 years ago. I stopped a few feet away from him, close enough to see the color drain from his face as he finally lifted his gaze from the child to me. My voice cut through the stunned silence of the garden, projecting loud and clear so that every senator, CEO, and socialite present could hear every single syllable. "Curtis, are you really planning to use violence on your own son on your wedding day? Or is that just the traditional way the Montgomery family welcomes its own flesh and blood?" The silence that followed my question was so heavy, it felt physically suffocating as hundreds of eyes darted between me, the frozen groom, and the two little boys who were the living proof of a secret that could destroy a dynasty. A few minutes later, when the echo of chaos was still hovering in the air, the entire garden sank into a deadly silence that felt heavier than the fog rolling off the ocean. The only sounds remaining were the soft whimpers of the boys who had stopped running and the frantic clicking of camera shutters from the reporters who realized they were witnessing the scandal of the decade. Irma was the first to break the suffocating tension because she knew that allowing my words to sink in would mean the irreversible end of her social standing in this community. She smoothed her silver dress with trembling hands and forced a plastic smile onto her face while turning to address the confused guests who were whispering frantically among themselves. She pointed a manicured finger at me with venomous accusation, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that betrayed her desperate attempt to control the narrative before it spiraled completely out of her grasp. Don't listen to her because she is nothing but a lying gold digger who is jealous of our success. These are definitely children she hired from some agency to ruin our honor and extort money from us. I did not waste my breath arguing with a woman who had convinced herself of her own delusions, because I had come prepared with something far more powerful than empty words. I reached into my worn-out leather handbag to retrieve the thick manila envelope containing the paternity test results I had secretly commissioned, using hair samples from Curtis's old hairbrush, which I had kept for years. I walked past Curtis, who was still staring at the boys in a state of paralyzed shock, and stopped directly in front of the altar where Whitney was standing like a marble statue. I did not hand the papers to her politely. Instead, I threw the heavy file down at the hem of her expensive designer wedding gown, with a dull thud that sounded like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict. Whitney, I suggest you look closely at that paper before you make the biggest mistake of your life. Do you really want to marry a man who is so cowardly that he denies the existence of his own biological children? Whitney looked down at the envelope lying on the white carpet for a long, agonizing moment before her curiosity overwhelmed her fear, and she bent down to pick it up with shaking hands. She tore open the seal and began to read the documents, her eyes widening as she scanned the undeniable scientific proof that confirmed a 99.9% probability of paternity between Curtis and the twins. The color drained from her face as the realization hit her that the perfect bachelor narrative the Montgomery family had sold her was a complete fabrication constructed to secure her father's political connections. She looked up from the papers to stare at Curtis, seeing him not as her charming fiancé, but as a spineless liar who had hidden a massive part of his life from her, just to get his hands on her inheritance. The betrayal ignited a fire in her eyes that burned hotter than the midday sun, transforming her shock into a blind rage that demanded immediate physical release. She ripped the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger, scratching her skin in the process, and hurled the sparkling stone directly into Curtis's face with all the strength she could muster. The ring struck his cheekbone with a sharp crack, leaving a small cut that began to bleed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional blow she delivered next. Whitney stepped forward and swung her hand in a wide arc, connecting with Curtis's face in a thunderous slap that echoed across the garden and was captured by every smartphone camera in the vicinity. You people are a bunch of sick liars who would say anything to trap me in your web, Curtis. I would rather die alone and old than step foot into this deceitful family of yours ever again. The wedding is canceled. She did not wait for an explanation or an apology because she knew that anything coming out of his mouth would be just another lie designed to manipulate her. Whitney gathered up the heavy layers of her silk skirt and turned on her heel to sprint back up the aisle, sobbing uncontrollably as she fled the scene of her humiliation. The guests parted like the Red Sea to let the runaway bride pass, leaving the Montgomery family standing alone in the wreckage of their reputation amidst the shattered glass and spilled champagne. Curtis stood frozen on the stage, a bright red handprint burning across his face, looking like a man who had just watched his entire future slip through his fingers, while Irma collapsed into her chair, clutching her chest in a theatrical display of distress that no one rushed to comfort. 2 days later, at the top-floor conference room of the city center commercial building, a cold atmosphere blanketed the meeting that was about to determine the fate of the Montgomery family. I sat in a high-backed leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany table, watching the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows while waiting for my guests to arrive. Irma and Curtis entered the room with the familiar air of arrogance that they wore like a protective armor, completely oblivious to the fact that they were stepping into the lion's den. They looked around the luxurious office with critical eyes, clearly assuming that I had rented this space by the hour just to intimidate them or to make myself look more important than I actually was. They sat down opposite me without waiting for an invitation, their body language radiating the same condescension they had shown me 5 years ago when I was nothing but a helpless girl begging for shelter. They still believed, even after the catastrophe at the wedding, that this meeting was merely a negotiation for child support payments, or a desperate attempt on my part to extract a settlement from them. Irma did not waste any time with pleasantries, because she wanted to end this humiliating chapter as quickly as possible so she could go back to damage control for her reputation. She opened her designer handbag with a sharp snap and pulled out a checkbook, scribbling a number onto the paper with aggressive strokes of her pen. She tore the check out and flicked it across the polished surface of the table so that it slid to a stop right in front of my hands. I looked down at the piece of paper to see the sum of $10,000 written on the line, a paltry amount that wouldn't even cover the cost of the celebration dinner I had planned for my staff later that evening. She leaned back in her chair with a smug expression, looking at me as if she had just bestowed a magnificent gift upon a beggar who should be grateful for her generosity. "Take this $10,000 and get out of our lives forever. Hand over the custody of the children to me immediately, because they need to be educated in a noble, aristocratic environment instead of living in squalor with a poor mother like you." I did not reach for the check, nor did I show any sign of anger at her insult, because the time for emotional reactions had passed long ago. At that precise moment, the heavy oak doors opened and my personal lawyer, David, walked into the room, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than Curtis's car. David walked toward the table with a confident stride that commanded immediate respect, placing his files down with a deliberate calmness that unsettled our guests. He looked at the check sitting on the table with a faint amusement before using the tip of his pen to slide it back across the wood until it fell off the edge and landed on the floor near Irma's feet. The disrespect in his action was calculated and precise, signaling to them that the power dynamic in this room was entirely different from what they had imagined. "I apologize, Mrs. Irma, but perhaps you have made a serious mistake regarding the situation here. My client, Ms. Loretta, earns this amount of money in just a single hour of work, so she certainly has no interest in your charity." Irma and Curtis stared at David in stunned silence, their mouths slightly open as they tried to process the absurdity of his statement. David did not give them time to recover. He pressed a button on the remote control in his hand, causing the large projection screen behind me to descend from the ceiling. The room dimmed as the projector hummed to life, displaying the logo of Iris Capital, followed by a complex flowchart of financial acquisitions and debt restructuring. I watched their eyes scan the screen, moving from confusion to recognition as they saw the familiar names of their family businesses listed under the Acquired Assets column. The presentation detailed every mortgage, every business loan, and every line of credit the Montgomery family had taken out over the last decade to fund their lavish lifestyle. David began to explain the technicalities of the debt acquisition, pointing out that Iris Capital had aggressively purchased the non-performing loans of the Montgomery estate from their original lenders over the past 2 years. The realization began to dawn on Irma, slowly manifesting as a pale sickness that drained the color from her rouged cheeks. She looked from the screen to me, her eyes widening in horror as she connected the dots between the ruthless investment firm that owned her debt and the daughter-in-law she had discarded. The woman she thought was living on food stamps was actually the person holding the leash around her neck. I stood up and walked over to the screen, placing my hand on the graph that showed their imminent insolvency, looking directly into the fearful eyes of the woman who used to terrify me. Do you really think I need your money, Irma? Look at the screen and understand that the person who is drowning in debt and about to be thrown onto the street is not me, but it is actually you and your son. The silence that filled the room after my question was heavy with the weight of their destruction, as the mother and son sat paralyzed in their chairs, finally understanding that they were no longer the masters of their own fate. 30 minutes later, the atmosphere in the meeting room became so tense and suffocating that one could hear the frantic beating of Curtis's heart echoing against the silence. I sat perfectly still with my hands clasped on the table while David finished laying out the stack of foreclosure documents that detailed every single violation the Montgomery family had committed against their loan agreements. I looked straight into the terrified eyes of my ex-husband and informed him that his decision to use corporate operational funds to pay for his extravagant wedding was a direct violation of the credit terms. My company had legally triggered the acceleration clause in their contracts, which meant that every single cent they owed was now due immediately in one lump sum. Since they obviously did not have millions of dollars sitting in their accounts to repay the debt, I had the legal right to seize all collateral assets to recover my investment without any further delay. David slid the legal notices across the table one by one, explaining in a calm and professional voice that the foreclosure process on the Bar Harbor estate had officially commenced this morning. He presented the court orders authorizing the immediate freezing of all their personal bank accounts and the sealing of their luxury vehicles pending auction. Irma gasped for air as if she were drowning because she realized that the roof over her head and the chauffeurs she depended on were being stripped away in the blink of an eye. She tried to protest by claiming that family heritage should account for something, but David reminded her that in the world of finance, heritage does not pay the bills. However, taking their material wealth was only the first part of my plan, because I needed to ensure they could never come near my children again. I signaled for David to place the final document on the table, a single sheet of paper that carried far more weight than all the financial records combined. I explained to Curtis that misusing business loans for personal expenses constituted serious bank fraud and embezzlement under federal law. I had enough evidence in those files to send him to federal prison for at least 10 years, where he would have to trade his tailored suits for an orange jumpsuit. Curtis began to hyperventilate as the reality of a decade behind bars crashed down on him, destroying whatever shred of dignity he had left. I leaned forward slightly to deliver the ultimatum that would test the true depth of his character, offering him a cruel but necessary escape route from his legal nightmare. Curtis, you have two choices. One is to sign this paper and leave here as a free man, but with empty hands, or two is to prepare yourself to go to jail for credit fraud. The document in front of him was a voluntary termination of parental rights, a legal declaration that he surrendered all claims to Kyle and Kevin permanently. If he signed it, he would never see them, speak to them, or be recognized as their father ever again in exchange for my silence regarding his financial crimes. The room fell into a heavy silence as Curtis stared at the pen, his hand shaking violently as he weighed the value of his own flesh and blood against his personal freedom. He looked at me with pleading eyes, hoping to find a trace of the woman who used to love him, but all he found was a wall of ice. "Don't do this, Loretta. I beg you, I will sign. I don't want to go to jail, Mom. I have to sign it. I have no other choice." He grabbed the pen with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline, not hesitating for a second to sacrifice his children to save his own skin. Irma lunged forward to try and stop him because she viewed the boys as her last connection to a legacy and potential future assets. But she was too late. She watched in horror as her son scribbled his signature on the line, effectively selling his fatherhood for a get-out-of-jail-free card. "You idiot, Curtis. You signing that means you lose everything, Loretta. You are evil. You cannot do this to us." I snatched the paper away the moment the ink touched the page, verifying the signature before handing it securely to David. A wave of absolute disgust washed over me as I looked at the man who had just traded his sons for his own safety without a moment of genuine remorse. I pressed the intercom button to summon the building security, ordering them to escort the trespassers out of my property immediately. Curtis and Irma were dragged out of the office, kicking and screaming, their voices fading down the hallway until silence finally returned to the room, marking the end of the Montgomery curse on my life. 1 month after that legal storm, the lives of myself and my children had returned to their inherent peaceful trajectory, but the world of the traders had completely collapsed. The news of the Montgomery family bankruptcy spread through the business community like wildfire, shattering the illusion of prestige they had maintained for decades. The bank seized the Bar Harbor estate within a week, forcing Irma to watch helplessly as strangers auctioned off her beloved antique furniture and family heirlooms to pay off a fraction of the debts she had accumulated. She was unceremoniously evicted from the only home she had ever known and forced to move into a dilapidated social housing apartment on the outskirts of the city, where the paint was peeling off the walls and the heating barely worked. The stress of losing her status and her home proved too much for her fragile constitution, triggering a mild stroke that left her partially paralyzed on one side and unable to speak clearly. She now spends her final days sitting alone in a wheelchair by a dirty window, trapped in a prison of silence and bitterness, with no one to visit her, except the state-appointed nurse who treats her with indifferent coldness. Curtis did not fare much better than his mother, because his lack of real-world skills and his tarnished reputation made him unemployable in the finance sector. He was eventually forced to take a job as a sales assistant at a discount shoe store in a shopping mall, a position he would have mocked mercilessly just a few months ago. The elite social circle that once embraced him now treated him like a pariah, refusing to acknowledge him when they coincidentally walked past his store. He lives in a constant state of torment and regret, especially on the days when he walks past the newsstand and sees my face smiling confidently from the cover of major business magazines. He has to live with the agonizing knowledge that he traded a loving family and a brilliant future for a life of servitude and loneliness because he was too cowardly to stand up to his mother. While they suffered the consequences of their greed, Kyle, Kevin, and I settled into a beautiful new villa overlooking the ocean, a home that was bought with honest money and filled with genuine laughter. The boys adjusted remarkably well to their new reality, thriving in an environment where they are encouraged to be themselves, rather than being molded into heirs for a dying dynasty. I watched them playing in the garden yesterday, chasing each other with the same innocent joy they showed at the wedding, and I realized that they had not asked about their father a single time since that day. We have built a life founded on transparency and unconditional support, ensuring that they will grow up to be strong men who understand the value of integrity and respect. I sat on the terrace with a glass of wine in hand, looking out at the horizon and realizing that I had fulfilled the promise I made to myself 5 years ago in that blizzard. I did not need their apology, because an apology from a narcissist is just another form of manipulation, and I certainly did not need their forgiveness. I chose to sever the ties completely, not out of cruelty, but out of a fierce necessity to protect the future of my children from the toxic poison of the past. The victory was not in their destruction, but in my liberation, proving that a woman who is pushed to the edge can either fall or learn to fly, and I chose to soar. Lessons from this story. After everything, the one thing I understand most clearly is that true power comes from self-reliance. When you build your own throne, no one can ever knock you off it again. I spent years rebuilding my life from nothing so that when the day came to face them, I didn't have to beg, depend on anyone, or wait for permission to live with dignity. And I also learned this: never judge someone just because they look ordinary or are going through hard times. The Montgomerys saw me in jeans and an old car and assumed I was weak and broken. But they forgot one simple truth. People with real strength often move in silence, while those who rely on appearances are the first to collapse when the storm hits. In the end, I realized that family is